All right, folks. So, welcome back. This is kind of like a quick refresher, but mainly a discussion of the research plan for the Theater of the Oppressed study. As you know, we're going to be dealing with qualitative data and as well as some quantitative data, and we want to talk about how we're actually going to go about analyzing that information. So, quick refresher. Um, Again, we're doing this research following grounded theory, and I'm not going to go over some of the details. Some of the first slides are slides that, again, already exist in the video on memo writing, which I believe, Angie can correct me if I'm wrong, that I think that's on Box or something. If not, maybe we should put it on Box and possibly online. I have some folks that want to actually learn a little bit of the methodology, so that could also maybe go on the Here Center YouTube page or something. But either way, if you want to get more of those details, go find that video and you'll be able to get that information. But quick refresher, grounded theory is in essence a systematic methodology that's used to analyze qualitative data. It's one of the more popular methodologies in qualitative research. It's not the only methodology, but it's definitely one of those methodologies that has kind of been discussed for many decades, and folks have been able to improve on the approach. And so it's something that will be useful for us in this study. Grounded theory uses, again, an inductive approach. In other words, we begin with the data itself, and through the analysis of that data, often following this iterative approach, meaning you go back and forth with that data, you end up developing a theory. This is different than the deductive approach, which is common in quantitative research, where you begin with a theory and then you test that theory with like data. We're going to begin with that data, and through the process of an iterative analysis, we're going to be able to see what are the relevant hypotheses and theories. It also follows a comparative method. You're constantly comparing, the data to other participants, other aspects of the qualitative data. You may look at the data one time, but then you have to look at it maybe 2 or 3 more times, and you're comparing your different impressions as you're getting to immerse yourself more and more in that data. This approach has been around again for many decades. It began originally with the work of Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss, and eventually beginning around like the 80s and 90s, we started to see a other people coming in and trying to make this approach even more sophisticated. And this is where you would see folks like Julia Corbin and Kathy Charmaz kind of coming into the fray, bringing in their perspectives. But in general, grounded theory has these 3 basic phases. And what we're going to focus on today is kind of breaking down how are we actually going to go through these phases? What tools will you need to do? What are the sequence of events? What are some of the things that you are going to be looking for? And all of this is going to be driven through a memo writing process. It's the memo writing process for sure is essential in the open coding component as we're trying to identify concepts and themes, but this is something that's going to continue on to axial coding and selective coding, and I'll discuss how we're going to approach that memoing in those phases. You're going to see that more or less the plan for memoing is pretty straightforward and doesn't really change in its general approach across these 3 phases. It's just really the specific stuff you'll be looking for within these phases that we want to map onto that methodology that we'll be talking about. So again, the memos have several roles that they play in grounded theory. And one of those roles is moving the analysts from the raw data itself to a certain level of what they call abstraction or thinking theoretically. And again, thinking theoretically means that you begin with the data, you identify some concepts, and then you start to devise a logic of how those concepts are related. And that's the beginnings of an emerging theory. But now that emergent theory in some ways becomes something that we can anchor ourselves to develop further concepts. Once we develop those subsequent concepts, we then go back to the theory to see if the theory still holds, if it needs to be changed, if we need to add things to it. And so when you're writing memos, again, don't simply think that you're writing down the themes themselves or your understanding of those things. That is happening on top of you thinking theoretically. So you should already be thinking in terms of what possible relationships could exist among these themes that are just popping up before my very eyes, right? So it is okay to lay out the concepts, but also lay out the relationships. And the way you think about a concept, again, on day one may be very different than you think about that same concept 50 days later, or the relationships among concepts. All of this is normal. It is part of a qualitative, iterative process. So if you feel like you're going back and forth, like maybe, shouldn't we be moving forward? I always tell students, that's a normal feeling, especially in qualitative research. So if anything, kind of like lean into that a little bit. It's actually a sign that you're probably being a good and thorough qualitative researcher. Another role of memoing is to expose gaps in the data. And I think this is especially true when you're, which is what we're going to be doing in this project, which is working collaboratively as well as individuals in the memo writing process. And I'll discuss a little bit more in detail towards the end. What does it mean to work as individuals versus collaboratively in the memo writing process? But when we are, examining qualitative data, again, you as the researcher have your own perspective on things. And as humans, we are, it's not possible to attend to everything that can possibly exist in a, especially in a complex data set. And as humans, as soon as we identify something, there's a natural tendency to want to keep focusing on that thing, at the expense of other things that we can focus. And so memoing is a great way to, look at data and see, hey, it's interesting. Here's an example. Let's say I read these 3 quotes from 3 different participants, and all 3 are saying something similar. But is it possible that the 3 similarities are getting me so focused that I'm not seeing possible differences that coexist among the similarities? It could easily work the other way around, where I'm looking at these 3 quotes, 3 different people, and they all seem different. And I'm so focused on the differences that I may miss the similarities. So it's natural as memo writers, again, that we can't absorb everything. And so gaps could easily exist in the data. Then we have the coder bias. And I think this is where memoing is truly helpful. The way I would code a text is likely going to be different than the way Carrie's going to code it, or Will, or anyone else on this team. There's probably going to be a lot of crossover, but there's going to be some areas of non-overlap. It's those areas of non-overlap that can be like, oh my God, Carrie, you're right. I didn't see that, but I see it now. And now that changes my original memo, because I have now read Carrie's personal memo, and it made my memo make more sense. So there's a collaborative element to this. And by using memoing in this way, we can do what's called theoretical sampling, right? We can sample the amount of data that we need in order to be able to speak of the phenomenon in a systematic and scientific way. And this will influence, well, what do we need to sample? If I missed something in my first viewing, but Carrie's memo totally caught it, I need to go back and sample again from that same quote that I had read before, and possibly code that information that, again, I didn't see, but Carrie did. I've said this already. Again, all of us come with different levels of experience and attitudes and perspectives. And it's important to write these things down. We also have assumptions. about the data. I know I carry tons of assumptions all the time. Many of them get like popped like a bubble. I'm like, oh my God, I assumed, X, mu, Y, but that's not the case. So it's important to note those assumptions that we're making. And so again, it is not an uncommon thing to see a qualitative researcher say, again, I'm a feminist, and when I read this quote on toxic masculinity, I am bringing my assumptions of what masculinity is and what I define as toxic in the masculine gender, right? Some of those assumptions may match up to other people's assumptions or aspects of the social reality. Some of those assumptions may be something that is totally socially constructed in my own lived experience and may not have as much connection to what we call social reality. But being aware of what those assumptions are and logging those assumptions are things that keep us honest. And in many ways, memoing in this context is very important for validating the rigor of the qualitative project, of the qualitative study. Keep in mind that we live in an era where it's still highly positivist, and qualitative researchers have to defend their work in ways that may seem unfair, but we do still have a responsibility to be systematic. And part of being systematic is being aware of when things kind of, for lack of a better word, can lead to unreliable information. One last note, though, of course, qualitative people, they're not interested in validity. We are more interested in authenticity. But I think that stresses this point even more. To be an authentic qualitative researcher and to have authentic qualitative work, you must lay out your viewpoints and your assumptions. If not, you are being dishonest in that regard. And so unlike positivist research, which says you have to be neutral, because of course that's something that's easily doable. If you can hear the sarcastic tone in my voice, clearly you know where I stand on positivism. But qualitative people, in some ways, again, they're a little more honest about those biases, and they totally believe it's acceptable to bring that into the scholarship. Memos can also be a good way to start thinking about what literature do we need to dig ourselves into. Again, this is interesting because quantitative research, you usually begin with a literature search first. You see the gaps in the literature and you construct a research question or a set of hypotheses, and then you test it out by collecting data. But grounded theory in some ways, again, is beginning backwards. It's saying, I have all of this data. I'm not necessarily sure at the moment what is important and what is less important. And if that's the case, then what literature should I be searching at the moment? Well, you kind of don't know yet. You have to immerse yourself in the raw experience first in order to figure out, okay, I think these are the important themes. I think these are the important relationships. Now, what have others been saying about these themes and relationships? And so memoing can be a great way to clue ourselves into areas of the literature that we'll eventually need to write about in a given manuscript to back up our work, but our work in the broader context of similar work that's been done in the scientific community. And by virtue of informing literature searching is going to be important for writing the manuscript. So memos are very, very important. What you write down may not go word for word in a manuscript, but you never know. You may want to quote part of your memo in the manuscript, and so then it does go in there. Either way, memos are going to play a crucial role in moving a project, again, from pure idea to dissemination. So I look at it as an entire research process. And right now we're at the beginnings. We are trying to understand the data, but at some point we're going to want to write up this stuff and share it with other people and go to conferences and tell other people how you can actually apply this in a real world situation in order to affect change. So all of this is a process that involves short-term as well as kind of like long-term goals that we want to achieve. And the memos can help us transition through that. I mentioned that grounded theory is rooted in what's known as the comparative method, which is just fancy talk for the fact that we are going to be looking at a case or participant. Case simply means the unit of analysis, the source that gave us the data that we're analyzing. A case could be many things. It can be an individual, as in our case, these are faculty who type down their responses. But in theory, a case could be a department in a college or an institution. We as researchers define what those cases are. It is also possible in qualitative research to look at multiple units of analysis if you have the data for it, or if you're able to speak about one unit of analysis in terms of another unit of analysis. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that's in essence what the comparative method is. I'm going to be looking at responses from one participant, and I'm going to go through this memoing experience. I'm going to be generating themes. I'm going to be identifying relationships. I'm going to be noting my viewpoints, my biases, my assumptions. And once I do that with one participant, I now have a lens that I didn't have before I went through the data of that first participant. Well, that lens stays with you. It's not a permanent lens. It's a lens that definitely changes, but you now have a set of experience or knowledge that you didn't have before you read this one participant's memo. Well, when you go to the second, third, fourth, those prior memoing experiences are going to impact each subsequent memoing experience. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. Oops, I don't know why. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I dropped something on my mouse. And so it is totally acceptable to, begin the first parts of coding with not much to speak about. But once you go through 3, 4, 5 participants, you're like, wait a minute, there's a lot that I have to say. And then you go back to that first participant, I'm like, oh my God, there's so much that I missed. There's so much more that I need to capture because of what I've learned through subsequent experiences with other cases. So you're going through this constant, let me look at a participant, let me jot down, let me look at the next, now let me compare. Let me jot down, now let me compare. And it goes on and on until you exhaust your data set. Other considerations about memo writing. Memo writing is, in the tangible sense, an individual activity, right? Like will not literally be holding my hand as I'm writing down my thoughts, right? It's not that kind of collective experience, although I don't know why I just got the image of Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore from Ghost. It's not that kind of, you're gonna walk me through it. I see Doug laughing because he's a theater guy. I know he got that reference. But it is a tool that can definitely facilitate conversations among team members. So in this regard, memoing, yes, it's being done as an individual act, but the products being produced through those actions can have both personal as well as collective implications. Memos are also a way to keep ourselves, again, honest. As I alluded to earlier, qualitative researchers, we're held to different standards in order to demonstrate that the work we do is rigorous, systematic, and worthy of contributing to the scientific community's knowledge base. So memos are a way that, in essence, we record, a history of our actions. Later on, there's a term that I don't use, but is one that I found in an article, which is, it's almost like we're leaving an audit trail. We can go back to those memos to see where changes in thought happen, where new ideas sprung, where old ideas were left aside, all for the purposes of ultimately producing this final product, which is a theory grounded in the data itself. Memos, again, have a collaborative element to it. I'll go into this in a few slides, but there is a phase where, especially if you're doing qualitative research involving several team members, you actually do want to have phases in the analysis process where you come together and discuss your individual thoughts. So you take these individual memos, but then there's going to be a phase where, as a group, we need to modify that memo, construct a final memo. Memos, again, they can isolate the relevant data, but they can also be clues about what's not that important to focus on. Because depending on the theory that's being developed, based off of what we're observing through this process of induction and iteration, we might find that some concepts, it was important at first, but now it really doesn't play that big of a role. Or maybe we've taken that concept and we collapsed it with another concept because they were so similar. At first, they seemed like they were different phenomena, but now we're going to take these two things and we're going to collapse them into one broader phenomenon. And so we should be looking out for that data versus these other things. This helps us achieve what's called theoretical saturation, that at a certain point, if we've been able to identify the relevant concepts and the relevant relationships, then with each subsequent viewing of more participant data, you're starting to realize, hey, wait a minute, these folks are more or less saying these similar things that we've been able to see from the prior participants. At a certain point, you have saturated your theory. There is not much more than you can add to this framework that you're developing based off of the prominent concepts and prominent relationships. Again, though, there's no barometer that says you've achieved theoretical saturation. There's no number, right? It is what theoretical saturation means is going to be very, very specific to the nature of the project. So theoretical saturation of the same data set in one project may mean something different than saturating it in a different project. Again, all depending on what the focus of that immersion theory is. This is an interesting concept, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later. We'll even go through an example. But we are in a unique situation where we also have quantitative data as well as qualitative data, and there's ways that we can connect and we know what came from who. So there's this concept in mixed methods grounded theory of qualitizing. Doug, theater people are not the only folks that make up terms. I kid you not, right? Us social scientists are notorious for making up terminology. And so like you're in good company is what I'm saying. And qualitizing, like memoing, is technically not a word, but it is a word now because I've added it to my dictionary here in Word. So hence I don't get that little red underline anymore. But to qualitize is simply the process of generating qualitative meaning from data that began quantitative. There's a neat example. I believe these are articles that Carrie shared with us, some of which I've used to kind of like base this presentation on. But if you didn't have a chance to read some of those articles, there's this one study where participants were asked to rate themselves on a 7-point scale. How much do they identify as a researcher? But then at interview, they were asked, why did you pick that answer? What does a 1 on a 1 to 7 scale mean? What does a 7 on that scale mean to you? And why did you rate yourself the number that you did? And what you find is that some of these participants, after being asked this question, sometimes they change their response. They're like, you know what? I think now that I've gone through more research, I probably would rate myself higher. Others would say, you know what? I might rate myself a little lower than I did because now I have a more realistic idea of what doing research is. And I thought I was a researcher until I was actually asked to do it. And so it's very fascinating, again, how you can take their initial quantitative response on a scale of 1 to 7, and then when you ask them to dig into that, you get this richness of experience and reasoning and their internal logic and how they ultimately, in this example, define what a researcher is, what entails a researcher, and what entails science. And again, we'll go through some of those examples because I thought it was a neat article, so I wanted to use those as examples of how. Okay, so terminology again. That doesn't mean that we as our own team can't use our own terminology. Doug, we are totally allowed to make up our own terms, especially when we're writing a paper. But why make up a term if there's already an existing term out there that captures what we're trying to say anyway? Well, here's a list of terms, and all of them are probably terms that we think we know what they mean because of our other research experience, but it's interesting that these terms have a more specific meaning in the context of memo writing. So let's go over what those things are. There's a lot of overlap with what we think these terms are, but then there's a little more specificity. So researcher, I think we all share this idea. It's anyone that's involved in this research project. So everyone at this Zoom meeting, and everyone who's going to be either coding data, writing the paper, schooling us on theory of the oppressed, like Doug did, all of us are researchers, right? So we can use that term to refer to ourselves. Then there are the interviewers, right? These are the actual people who if you're doing an interview as the way of collecting your data, you would fit in that role. And sometimes you have multiple roles. If you're the researcher and the interviewer, you're kind of by default a researcher if you're in any one of these things. We collected data. I don't think it was through interviews, right? It was their open-ended responses. But whoever did that collecting for us, they would have that term interviewer, if you will, or in this case, I guess it would be surveyor if they were giving out surveys. Then there are the coders. This is where the language is a little more specific now. It's any person who actually read and extracted categories, themes, relationships from the corpus. The corpus, again, is the qualitative data set. In this case, correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie, the corpus is in the form of transcripts, written transcripts, right? So anyone who reads this transcript and extracts themes and relationships is by definition a coder. But a coder is also writing down memos about their coding process, about what they're observing. So if you write down a memo about this data, you are the author of that memo. And if that memo is the first memo that you write about that participant, you are the author of what we call a draft memo. Before I actually go into the other definitions, I may have forgotten, but I'll mention this now and reiterate it later. Memoing is something that you do for every participant. Every participant in your data set should have some kind of memo of record associated with them, right? So if we have 15 participants, each of those 15 participants should have a memo associated. If it's the first time you're looking at that participant's data, and it's the first time you're memoing about them, then you have authored a draft memo. The draft memo serves an important function. Again, it's capturing all of the things that we discussed up until now. Your viewpoint, your perspectives, the themes you see, the relationships among those themes that you observe, any of the biases that you carry. All of that are noted in the draft memo by that author. The intention, though, of this draft memo is to eventually send it off to a reviewer or a reader. Readers and reviewers are kind of similar, but in many ways, the reader doesn't do anything tangible with the draft memo. They just read it. And they may do so because they just want to be familiar with the project. They may have other tasks involved in the project, and so they don't need to do the coding per se, but they need to read that memo in order to understand the data or write up a section, let's say, right? So we would just call them readers of the memo. But really what we want to do with a draft memo is send it off to a reviewer. And this is someone else on the research team who did not author this draft memo. This reviewer will receive someone else's draft memo and they will comment not on the raw data, that was already done by the original coder. The reviewer is, in essence, going to look at the draft memo. And they are going to, in essence, make comments, ask questions, make edits of that draft memo based off of their experiences. Keep in mind that this reviewer is a coder for some other participant. So not everyone is going to be coding every single participant. That would kind of be a little bit impractical, especially in a large team such as ours. And this is something that the authors of this table, Lee and colleagues, noted themselves, that they were working across 2 institutions with like 7 some researchers, right? So can you imagine all 7 reading all the part? It would be a very impractical exercise, and you might not actually get that much for the effort. So what we often do is divvy up the work. And so people are wearing multiple hats. I may be a coder for participant 1, but a reviewer for participant 5. And the other researcher is vice versa, right? But if you're the reviewer, you, by this point, should also have experience having coded some things yourself. So this is where you might know, oh, I agree with the draft memo author. I also observed theme X in the data. But the reviewer could easily say, but I don't think that the relationship that the original author noted is well explained, or the way that I understand it. I understand the relationship between these concepts as Y. Meanwhile, the original author of the memo is seeing it as Z, right? So as the reviewer of the memo, you get to write down all those things where you agree, where you disagree, where you have questions, or where you have suggestions. All of this information is fair game. It's intended in order to, kind of be a check on each other, but also isolate what's going to be really important in terms of developing the theory and filtering out some of the things that are not going to be as relevant. Once the reviewers write up this memo, they have in essence authored a comment memo. So a reviewer becomes the author of the comment memo. And again, the comment memo is just what I described. It is your take on your colleague's original draft and all the things that you suggest, want to comment on, include, agree with, disagree with, and anything else that I didn't mention right now. When we have a collection of comment memos, we then, as a team of researchers, come together and try to resolve all the inconsistencies. We try to strengthen all the consistencies, and in the process, come up with for lack of a better phrase, a final call on what we believe this data is saying from this particular participant. So again, keep in mind, all of this is happening at that participant or case level. And so at one point for each case in our data set, we want to have what we believe is this finalized memo. The memo that contains those codes, those relationships, and those comments that are going to be important for developing the theory. And as well as the comments that, will help us steer away from possible distractions to the theory development process. So let's get into the when, what, and hows of memo writing. because it's one thing to be told what a memo is or what its purpose is, but we want to know how to actually do it. And again, memoing, when do you do this? In some ways, you're doing it all the time. It is, again, part of a constant, I underline that on purpose, a constant comparative method. As the data is being coded, you are tracking what we call these incidences of the data. How, and again, this sounds quantitative, but it doesn't need to be interpreted quantitative, but how frequently, how common is this incident across the data set, right? Does it happen at the same frequency, the same degree or strength? These are things that we're constantly checking for. So if one of the incidences that I'm going to be coding for are cases where faculty reported being uncomfortable about the theater of the oppressed activities, right? We need to define what does it mean to report an uncomfortable experience. And then we need to be able to have a tangible incident, in other words, an example from the data set that, you know, embodies that theme, that code, that idea of being uncomfortable with doing theater of the oppressed. Once we know what that is, we know what we're looking for. What is the incidence of that? Is the incidence always appearing in the same situation, to the same degree, from the same individuals? There's so many ways that you can think about these incidences. For every new incidence you encounter, you as an analyst might want to stop and compare it to a previous incident, right? So if I'm reading something from faculty 1, and they report this incident of being, you know, physically uncomfortable doing theater of the oppressed, like I literally started sweating, and they write that down, right? And that made me feel physically uncomfortable. I can make a note of that. And let's say I'm reading participant 5, and then participant 5 says, oh my God, like my hands were shaking at the idea of being called out. That's within this idea of there's a physiological reaction. These are incidences. Did they manifest exactly the same way in participant 1 and 5? No. But they are reporting something very similar, a physiological response to doing theater of the oppressed in this example. But these incidences could be many things. It could also be joy at being exposed to theater of the oppressed knowledge. Like, this was a pleasant experience to be able to see things from the student perspective, right? Well, what if that pops up in other cases, right? We want to go back to those prior incidences to see the similarities, to see those differences. And again, similarities could be, you know, where these things take place, how they take place, among whom do they take place. Differences can also happen across those dimensions as well. The early phases of memoing, again, because you got to start somewhere. That first case that you look at, your coding experience and the product that comes out of that coding experience is going to be different than when you are up to participant 10, because you're just gaining more experience and you're seeing more of the corpus, the raw data set. So it's actually not uncommon that the first thing that you tend to focus on are things that stand out, and things that stand out are differences, right? Things that don't stand out that much are things that are homogeneous and the same, right? Like we tend to kind of gloss over those things. Don't necessarily, you know, view this as a bad thing. It's probably just something that cognitively is kind of like, you know, typical. You're going to focus on the thing that pops out the most. This pop out effect, right, will make us see the differences more clearly than those similarities. So your early coding will probably be a bunch of like, this participant is different from that, and this is different from that, and this one's different from that. At a certain point, though, you're going to start to see those similarities because you're going back to your prior incidences. How do you do this iterative process? There's no one way to do it. And again, I think this is definitely something that I've gotten from students that I've worked with about qualitative research. And the thing that makes them uncomfortable is that there is a certain level of flexibility on your part versus me giving you a series of steps that you must follow faithfully, or else you're not going to get the right answer. Again, a t-test, you can only do those things a certain way to get the right answer, and there is a quote-unquote right answer. This isn't the case when you're doing qualitative research, and especially grounded theory. And so your memos will reflect that kind of flexibility. The goal ultimately is to, again, record those emerging themes and the emerging theory as it's developing. So as I alluded to earlier, there's, at this point, it's kind of informal. You're not really focused so much on strict grammar. Yeah, it's a stream of consciousness kind of experience where you're just laying out those immediate thoughts, those impressions, feelings, perceptions, attitudes. They're all being elicited through the experience of immersing yourself in the data of a specific case. And this is, again, happening through all phases of grounded theory, open coding especially, but it can also happen in our case, I think should happen during axial and selective coding. Because memoing is flexible, again, there isn't necessarily right or wrong. There's no need to actually rewrite old memos or delete them. If anything, we want to preserve the record. What we do as researchers is that we add to already existing memos, right? So I'm not going to go back to my draft memo and say, I'm going to delete this and this and this and write up a finalized memo. No, preserve the draft memo. But from the draft memo, you can add, modify things to come up with that finalized memo. So don't feel like compelled again, like, oh, this was wrong now. We didn't see it before. I'm going to delete this. No, all of this was necessary. And in fact, we need that audit trail in order to be able to describe it, especially if reviewers have the question when it comes time to publication, like, what was the logic? What was your process by which you went from raw data to this theory that you developed? And part of it is this trial and error experience that comes through a coding and comparison procedure. You code, you compare, you code, you compare, you code, you compare, and we do this until we saturate the theory, until we don't really learn much from doing that. And I promise you, there will come a point where you can only look at this data so much and you realize there isn't really much more to say. I think we isolated what we needed to isolate. We've accounted for the peripheral stuff that may not be, again, as central. And now we can speak about this model versus just speaking about data. What do we actually memo? Memoing, again, is a subjective process. So there's no one way of doing it. And owing to different levels of experience, different levels of knowledge, different levels of expertise. I'm a social psychologist, Carrie's a developmental psychologist, Will is an expert in depth studies, but he's also a cognitive linguist. I mean, there's so much knowledge, experience, and different types of expertise that exist in this one research team. If anything, we for sure are following the interdisciplinary tenet of critical race theory. No one can deny that this team is following that tenet faux show, right? And I'm very proud to brag that we at the very least follow that tenet. But we follow the other tenets pretty well as too. But despite the fact that we do have different experiences, knowledges, and that we have our own way of memoing, there are at least some important things that all of us should memo. Just because we do need to have, some common thing that will allow us to communicate across these memos. Keep in mind that at a certain point, right, when I write a draft memo, someone else is going to be reading the draft memo to create a comment memo. And then those comment memos, we're going to be discussing them as groups to come up with a finalized memo. So in order to make sure that we're all talking more or less about the same thing, some standard stuff that we might want to put in our memos is what date are you actually doing the memoing, right? We want to have a chronology. And believe it or not, those dates can mean many things, right? That date that you memo, when we look back, it could be something as simple as, oh, these were the first participants that we looked at, and these were the later ones. And we found, oh, there was a pattern in our earlier coding versus our later coding, right? So there's a methodological implication for that. There could also be a substantive implication for that. Again, not to bring in extreme examples or touchy examples, but I often find that these kind of like work. Can you imagine that you're doing a study just like this, a grounded theory study on attitudes among, Americans regarding Israelis and Palestinians? But you were doing the study before October 7th. And then October 7th happens in your memory. That date already tells you something. That date is special in history. And that date, if you are aware of what's happening, is going to color your impressions just because of the topic that you were studying, even though you did not expect this thing to happen on October 7th, right? So dating your memos can also have those more substantive implications, where that particular date is a stamp of a moment in history. And you could easily take your experiences memoing and then tie it back to these historical events and all that. But you may never know that if that date isn't there, right? And you can't trust your memory, like, oh, I remember coding these like in October or something. A date stamp is the best way to kind of log that information. And again, add to the rigor of doing this kind of qualitative research. Oftentimes when we're memoing, we might want to either refer to a part of the text, like a sentence, or maybe even an entire paragraph. So it behooves us to, if we either quote the thing or merely paraphrase it or just talk about it in passing, we want to make a reference of where that piece of data that you're focusing on, where can we find it in the data set? So the location of that text that you're coding. And this could be done in many ways. And maybe as a team, we need to have a conversation, not today, but a conversation of those more logistical kind of things, like what kind of system do we want to use for dating? Do we want to put month, day, year, etc.? Even the time of day. There might be a mood thing. Again, memoing is informal. In one of the chapters I was reading, it was almost said in a humorous way, but it's kind of true, where like sometimes your best ideas come in the shower. Like, oh man, sometimes you gotta memo something. And I'm like, I got a little notepad here right next to the toilet, so I'm just gonna like memo something there because I don't want that idea to go away. So because it's an informal process, we do want to bring some level of systematic kind of like work to it. And so being clear, how are we going to date things at what level, and how do we want to note the location of certain texts? Do we want to refer to paragraph numbers, line numbers, participant ID numbers? Are we going to have pseudonyms? All of those things we need to just kind of discuss at some point when we get to the logistical things of how to best organize these memos. Your memos can include ways that you've reformulated your categories, right? When I first thought about this category, reading it from participant 1, this is what I thought this category meant. But now, having read, so-and-so, 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 and so-and-so, I think this category is better understood as this, right? And so you want to talk about, why are you reformulating a prior concept? Again, all of these memos should be listing your logic, your internal reasoning, your justification for your coding. There's this concept of best fitting nominalization, which, in human speak simply means, words matter, Will and I have had this conversation many times. Words matter, and we want to make sure that when we come up with concepts, when we come up with themes, that the word or phrase that we use to describe that category fits the data, right? So in other words, when we come up with the parts of the theory, you don't want to be casual about how we name things, because the way that one word is expressed by one individual can be interpreted completely differently by a different individual. And the point of qualitative research, or technically all research, is to try to have us all speak the same language. So when I express a term, the idea that I have about that term is also going to be shared with you. Right? Even words as simple as dominant could be thought of differently. And by the way, I had this recent experience about a week ago when I was talking about dominant. Someone just stopped me like, what do you mean by dominant? Oh, wow, actually, and I had to talk about dominant, subordinate, and power structure. And that conversation had nothing to do with power structures and hierarchy and what power means, the ability to control others. But I had to go there in order to describe adequately what I meant by domination and dominance in the context of that conversation. When we're developing these concepts, these terms, to us, the word dominant may make complete sense. We may know exactly what we're thinking about. All of us may end up getting the same visuals or words or rhetoric being primed in our heads, but that may not happen for others who don't have that same expertise or knowledge. So being aware of our audience, who we're writing for, is going to help us with best fitting nominalization. We can't speak in our language sometimes. Sometimes we need to speak in the language of those for whom the work is going to be most relevant. Relationships between categories, I talked about that again, that memos are meant to kind of like jot down those things. And sometimes when we have ideas about how a concept relates to another concept, sometimes it's in the form of a hypothesis. And guess what? That's totally cool. It could be in the form of a research question. How does self-efficacy relate to researcher identity? Because those two concepts have appeared in the data. Well, that's the beginnings of a possible relationship. But you may also have an idea of what that relationship is. And you may say, like, high levels of self-efficacy in science are going to make folks feel more like a researcher. That's a hypothesis, not a question. You are assuming, perhaps correctly, a direction, in this case, that high self-efficacy leads to more researcher identification, right? Again, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis to have. But it could also, again, come up in the form of a research question with no directionality. What if people already have a researcher identity, right? And it's those things that make them feel more efficacious. It could easily go the other way around. We want to write down moments where, do these categories really matter? Should we collapse multiple categories into one category? Maybe domination and authoritarianism and individualism are all reflecting one whole thing that we can collapse. Or maybe those things are so different that we need to expand them. So maybe it's not just domination. Maybe there's, physical domination, legal domination, symbolic domination, self-imposed domination, right? All of these things are possibilities. We may find ourselves with too many categories that need to be collapsed, or we may be finding ourselves with categories that have more nuance than we realized they did at the beginning. So we want to memo those moments when we need to collapse or expand. One of the many key things that we want to do in a memo, though, is eventually want to identify the important concept or concepts. Humans live in a complex system, but this system is not static. And depending on the individual, depending on the situation, some factors in that context will matter more than others. And that can easily be reflected in qualitative data as well. So when people are expressing their experiences through qualitative texts, they're human as well. Are going to probably be giving emphasis to some things and not that much emphasis to other things. Often those are indicators that of things that can be central to the theory we're developing, these core categories. Something that I alluded to earlier is depending on the level of analysis, you could be looking at data that comes from people, data that comes from groups, data that come from a department or an entire organization. All of those are what we call a unit of analysis. In our study, Theater of the Oppressed, data came from faculty members. These are individuals. So the unit of analysis are faculty. They're the most basic element from which the data is coming from. At the same time, we know that faculty interact amongst themselves, that they belong to a department. So it is possible, and it's totally allowed in qualitative research to make those connections. Even if you don't have data on a department, if we know they came from CSUN, you know something about CSUN. If you know that they came from the math department, you know something about the math department. You can connect that information with what these individuals are saying. So you can take individual level data and consider what are the implications for broader social units. Again, if one individual faculty member is reporting this, and then I see 3 other faculty members reporting this, and they're all from the same department, I can ask the question, or at least speculate, I wonder what those department meetings are like when those people are there as a collective. Can we assume, can we theorize that those things are happening in those broader ecosystems? So sticking with the nomenclature that Carrie and I have been kind of using, we're an individual within these broader social structures and institutions and smaller cohorts. We call them families and friends and peers and all that stuff. And we can consider how the individual connects to those broader social units, and we can make those notes. At this point, it may not happen so much at the beginning, but later on, when you have more experience coding data, you might start to see connections to prior research that you've done or prior literature that you expose yourself to. So for example, for me, I won't be surprised if when I'm reading something, I might be like, oh my God, this kind of reminds me of social dominance theory. Why? Because social dominance theory is a big theory that I'm familiar with, but it comes from social psychology. Carrie may be looking at the data and then realize, oh my God, like it's bidirectional developmental systems that I'm seeing here. It's the connection between the individual and their context, and the context and the individual. Well, Carrie's coming at it from this different perspective. She's bringing in her experience reading other literature. You are totally allowed to make those connections. It doesn't mean that those connections will necessarily enter into the final model, that they'll go into the final paper. All of these things, at the very least, will serve as stepping stones for that next, part that we need to be in the research process. So again, I like to think that, memoing, again, sounds like, oh, it's just something you should do on the side. And look, no, in this case, memoing is an essential part of grounded theory, because it's logging so much information, not only information that, again, is substantive, that it informs your theory, but it's logging all of this information that's methodological. It is your logic, your reasoning of why you chose this approach of going from data to theory. And we want to defend that. And these memos will come in handy for many reasons. And again, it'll help us connect to the literature so we can actually ground our specific project within the larger scheme of what's in the scientific community. Another thing that's cool about memos is that it can help, again, correct those initial impressions that we get. Those first few cases that we observe, they're going to give us a lot of information, but that information is very, very likely subject to change with further coding and further experience with the data set. And it's okay to jot down, again, when through that experience, we realize that my initial impressions of phenomena X no longer holds, and that my impressions of this phenomena have changed. They have either, for example, gone in a direction where I don't think it's relevant, or maybe my initial impression was, this phenomenon X just seems like a periphery thing, but now I think it's one of the central core categories that will either make or break this theoretical. You will only learn that through time and through logging that information and through conversation with your fellow research team members. Memos should also be logging what they call the features of the observed incidents. So again, every time you see evidence of this category, this incident, we want to make sure that we have an adequate, description of what it is. So what are some features of observed incidents that, and how can we log this in a memo? Again, it's about providing as much detail as you can. In some ways, there's never too much detail, but obviously you don't want to write an entire, dissertation on just one participant, right? So you want to have, your memos be of a length that is reasonable, but you should not necessarily limit yourself to certain word counts. You need to describe the category with as much description as that category warrants. And some categories are really easy to kind of describe and to convey. Other categories require much more effort, more description, more nuance. You also want to identify what I call the dimension of a category. And in this context, by dimension, all I'm referring to is the different ways that the category can manifest, or the different situations in which it can manifest. This can include things like, let's say that one of our categories is mentorship efficacy. Can I actually be a critical mentor? Well, there are dimensions to that, like high belief, low belief in myself. So there's a high and low component, right? There could also be a more qualitative, nominal component where I feel efficacious when I'm teaching math. But when I'm talking to someone that's not a math student, I don't feel like I can mentor them. So that has nothing to do with strength per se. That has to do more with the context or the interaction in which you're mentoring. When you're thinking about features of these incidences, there are some questions you can ask yourself to think about identifying dimensions or getting into rich description. So where does this category occur? So again, if the category is faculty doing critical mentorship, well, where would that occur? When does it occur? Under what conditions does it occur? When it does occur, when does it change or appear different? What are the consequences when this thing occurs, right? And these aren't the only questions you can ask, but these are some of, the basic questions. They're good starting points for you to think about, how can I provide a rich description of these observed incidences? And how can I identify potential dimensions? So, I'm probably I'll skip this slide just because there's a lot of bullet points. I might skip the next two on how to write memos. Some of this stuff I've kind of already mentioned, that allow for flexibility. We want to have some level of communication. So using, memo dates and ID numbers is an iterative process. Your memos can include quotes or just paraphrases of quotes. All of those things are totally allowed when you're writing memos. This is an interesting thing, but I won't spend too much time on it. This could be something that we talk about when we have a more logistic meeting, but classical grounded theory was a manual data analysis process. And by manual, I mean no computers. Mind you, again, classical grounded theory, right? Era of typewriters and index cards. And most people did their coding using these manual approaches. And there are different schools of thought on whether using qualitative software goes away from the classical way of doing grounded theory, if it does anything more than you could do without this fancy software, or if the software sometimes does more bad than good. Again, I'm not going to have that conversation here today, but I did just want to bring it up as something to think about. And there are different software programs out there if you do want to approach your memoing using some qualitative data software. Final points about memoing. Again, memos can be our audit trail to assure that we're doing rigorous, scientifically rooted, qualitative research. Your early coding will be very different than your later coding. Again, they're probably going to be short, not as descriptive as you would like them to be, but this is why we go back to earlier memos in order to comment on them and come up with a finalized memo for every participant that is thorough and does capture their lived experience. Memos will become, again, more complex with more data coding and more memoing. The more memoing you do, the more codes that appear, the more memoing you're going to have to do. So like, think of it like more memoing, more problems, but these problems are kind of good. So keeps us working. The basic methodology, again, I don't like talking in terms of steps, but if we had to break down the basic methodology of writing a memo, there are some steps, if you will, but these steps, again, are things that you can sometimes skip or go back to. Step one is something that has already happened in our project, which is we do interviews, and the interviews are transcribed and de-identified. In step two, this is where we're going to be coming in. We need to assign coders. This can be done through coding teams. I recommend following kind of like the work of Lee and doing what are called coding pairs. And again, we can have a conversation about that in a logistic meeting. Coding initially begins independently, but eventually we will get into a group and kind of discuss this as a collective. And every participant should have a memo of record. Step three, coders will take their information and create a draft memo for a participant. So the coder now becomes the author of the draft memo. Reviewers will then get access to these draft memos, and they will revise. The goal is to provide commentary on the analysis process, to identify gaps, to identify areas of agreement. The reviewers will then, on this draft memo, put in their input. This could be done probably in many ways. One way that I could see this being done is that, a draft memo can exist in a Word document, and a common memo can take the same draft memo and then add either track changes or comment bubbles. Again, those are logistical stuff that we can talk about later on. In step 5, the comment memos will be sent back to the original draft memo authors in order to resolve any differences, to focus on areas of agreement, with the intention of, as a group, developing a finalized memo for that participant. And it's that finalized memo that's going to basically have all the codes that we're going to need for open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. There are 3 parts to the finalized memo. Number 1 is what we call the participant description. So in essence, every participant will have a finalized memo, and they should all have at the minimum this information. This participant description can include things like their quantitative data, which we do have. So we might want to note in that finalized memo, for these 6 items, I believe there were 6 closed-ended questions, so-and-so put a 5 for this, a 4 for that, a 7 on this, and a 1 on that. Because that gives you information about that case that can help you understand what they're expressing in text. And again, you would usually do this in a mixed method situation such as ours. If all you have is qualitative data, you wouldn't be able to put in quantitative information. But you can have these rich descriptions of participants' experiences. And any other factors that you think are important, that we as a team have determined is important in this particular case or set of cases. So this finalized memo should have at least these 4 points. Step 3 of memoing is what they call coding analysis. And I know all this terminology sounds a little confusing because coding this and coding that, but again, you'll have access to these slides. But using the language of memo writers, step 2 is the coding analysis. Again, this is where the finalized memo, somewhere it includes a listing of the final themes and codes, right? So at this point, we've gone through the draft and we've gone through the comments, so we know what we want to focus on. That finalized memo should have a summary of those things, as well as the relationships among those concepts or codes. Again, this is to help us move from the raw data, which is the transcript, to abstraction, which is the theoretical model itself. By the time you have these memos are already in between the raw data and the final theory. So these are all stepping stones. This should list those final relationships. If we have, say, 6 concepts, but not everything is connected to everything, so it's not like a spoke model, but it may be something like, believe it or not, something like a hierarchical model where this one thing leads to these 2 things, but then this one thing leads to 3 things, and this other thing leads. We don't know what those relationships are, right? But by the time we have a finalized memo, we should already know what the final concepts are and how they link up with each other. And so this should have a listing or a description of what those final relationships are among that case, that participant. It can also include quotes from that participant to back up your work. And then cross-case analysis. We don't just focus on one participant and their finalized memo. We then take all the finalized memos and compare them, right? So we want to take these earlier memos, identify the differences, similarities in experiences, and hopefully through the process, we are already beginning to kind of answer, partially at least, some of the study's main driving questions. The reason why we are developing this theory. We should be answering that as we're developing the theory. Why this theory? Why is it important? How is it going to be answering these other deeper questions? And so by comparing the finalized memos, we should know ultimately, like, what is the main thing what is the main issue at hand, and how can we problematize that issue in order to research it? All right, I'm going to skip theme generation, and let's go into some examples of memoing, and then if there's time, we'll do a hands-on activity, and then we'll close it out. So this is from the study that I've been referring to by Lee and colleagues, published in 2009. And what they did is that they wanted to study undergraduates and their experiences doing research. And they collected quantitative as well as qualitative data. There was data collected before they gained research experience with mentors and working in the lab. And then there was data collected after they have been gaining experience. Working in a lab, working with a mentor, etc. So that's kind of the background of this study. So here's an example of a memo that captures relationships. So just take a few seconds to kind of read it. Or actually, I'll just read it really quick. So what you see here at the top is actually in italics. This is the quote from the transcript, copied and pasted onto the memo. The bottom part, which is in regular text, is the actual memo from the author. So italics is the participant. And this person, I believe, this person is a she. She says, once he started showing me the graphs of the numbers, that's when I started to see, oh, those are acting exactly the same way. But it could have been just this one, because that seems unexpected for them to act just the same way. It was after the 3rd or 4th experiment that I started thinking, oh, we could actually be doing something really cool here. So it wasn't like eureka moment at the very end. It was slowly seeing the building. So this is what this student was expressing, working on a project and then replicating this experiment. And what the researcher notes, or in this case, what the memo writer notes, is that like at the beginning, we see Bay using epistemic thinking. That's one of their concepts that they've identified in the study. And then she follows up this epistemic way of thinking with what they call a epistemic metacognitive skill. She's monitoring the validity of her own work. She realizes, I need to repeat this experiment many times before we know if this is actual scientific knowledge. And then she applies her epistemic metacognitive knowledge. She knows that in order to develop scientific knowledge, you have to go through this process, and this process involves publication. And so when things are published, that's an indication that you're engaging in scientific work, right? So what does this memo include? It includes the relevant quote, it's in italics. It lists 3 concepts at least. There may be some other concepts in here that we're not seeing, but at the very least, they mention epistemic thinking, this epistemic metacognitive skill, which is more like a behavior, and then this epistemic metacognitive knowledge, which is more like a belief about what constitutes scientific knowledge. So it's connecting a way of thinking with behaviors, with your way of constructing knowledge. Those are 3 different ideas being linked up in this one experience, all to show how Bay is seeing the social construction of scientific knowledge unfold. That not just any knowledge qualifies as scientific knowledge, but there's a process that you go through, a process of replication. And so this memo by the author, she is linking EMS with EMK in order to explain how Bay sees science unfolding. It's pretty neat, right? It's pretty cool. This is what they meant by thinking theoretically. You are already describing the data in terms of the concepts and theory being as it's being developed. Again, it's kind of a crazy thing. You think you want the theory first and then the data, but no, this is data first and then theory with data towards all theory. And it manifests slightly differently across each qualitative project, right? So we're just going through some commonalities and all that. So here's another example, and I think this is going to be relevant to us. Qualitizing. We actually have quantitative as well as qualitative data. So Taylor sees a 1 on the research scale as someone who has minimal experience. I'm going to skip through some of this. She feels that a 7 is the opposite of what she described as a 1. She answered a 5 on the survey. And she says, I feel like from the time that I answered your survey to now, I feel a lot more like a researcher, just in the sense that I've had a lot more exposure in the last few weeks to doing engineering-related research. So I've been exposed to another field in that sense. If I answered 7 for whatever reason on that, I would probably put myself at an 8 or a 9 right now. But then there's some other quotes that I don't put here. And Taylor initially answered a 6 in the interview, but then after further reflection, a quote that's not here, she actually brought herself down to a 5. Because in that other quote, she says, but now I'm realizing that with all that I know, there's more that I don't know. And so there's no way to be a 7. And then she gets into this thing, and that might be the next quote, I don't know. But really quickly, what do we see here in this memo? Again, you see a quote in italics. The memo includes the numerical rating. So it includes the quantitative data in the memo, so we know what she answered and how she changed her answer. And the memo written by the author is drawing a link between what she said and the number that she rated herself as. Cross-casing. What do we see in this memo? It mentions multiple cases, Francis, Riley, and Logan. So it's not just one person being mentioned in this memo. It's multiple people being mentioned in this memo. And then similarities are being identified, as well as differences. So we see how, Francis believes that it's improbable that an undergraduate can rate themselves a 7. But Riley and Logan think it's impossible for an undergraduate to reach a 7, right? Then there's on the bottom paragraph, it's about mentorship. Kelly felt that her identity was strengthened. Is it because of mentorship? But then Frances believes that not having a mentor actually forced her to do some more work that made her a strong researcher, right? And so you see how you're able to put more than one case in a memo and see how they had expressed similar as well as distinct experiences, in this case on the same topics, one of them being feeling like a researcher, that's the top paragraph, and the other topic being mentorship and whether mentorship made you feel like more of a researcher. Again, pretty cool stuff, I think, to our project and linking it up to what we were just talking about. So this is a figure taken from, again, this is an article that Carrie shared with us a few weeks ago. It's in that long chain of emails now about theater of the oppressed. And this is in essence what Lee and colleagues did. These were folks working at two different institutions on the same data set, working towards developing the same theory. And while we do not need to follow this figure literally, I think it was actually a good visual to kind of mention what we're talking about. So basically, they imagine that you have four coders, two at one campus and two at the other campus. Coders A and B, they read a certain set of cases, transcripts. Let's just call them transcripts 1 through 5. I'm making up that number. So coders A and B, they read transcripts 1 through 5. Coders C and D read transcripts 6 through 10, for a total of 10 transcripts. Coder A and B, C and D, they each memo each case separately as individuals. But then at one point, coder A and B, because they were reading the same cases 1 through 5, they get together and they make a draft memo for each participant, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Coders C and D from the other campus, they do the same thing. After coding individually, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, C and D get together to craft a common draft memo, one for each participant, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So now we have 10 draft memos. Now we go to the comment memos. Basically, the draft memos from A and B, they're given to C and D. And you can guess the draft memos from C and D are given to A and B. And then they go through a review to create the comment memo, again, to identify similarities, areas where they agree, areas where they disagree, areas where they have comments, areas where they have suggestions, anything else that the reviewers feel could add to the original draft memo. Once we have that, we now have 10 comment memos. How we resolve those things can happen in many ways. And I think we can do that collectively as all people coming together and saying, we have these 10 comment memos. What's going to stay? What's going to go as we create a finalized memo? Once we have a finalized memo, this is the stuff that has your open codes and your codes to do axial and your codes to do selective coding. It should all be there in the final memo. That doesn't mean that you don't go back to the raw data, but the finalized memos are designed, again, for you to go from the raw data, which is not the theory, to the theory, which is not the data. The memo is the bridge. Memos are your bridge between data and theory. And Will tell you, I'm all about bridging. Bridges are big analogy I use in my life and all that. And in this case, it totally fits. The memo, this is why the memo is so important to grounded theory. It's the thing that will let you cross that river from data to theory. So quickly, in the last 5 minutes, this is the original plan that we have drafted, and this is prior to me setting up this workshop. And like an iterative process, I have learned something myself from setting up this workshop that I now need to go back to the original and do some rethinking, right? So hey, let's put that iteration into practice, right? So this was the original idea that we begin with memoing, which we've discussed, in order to help identify the concepts and the themes and then the relationships. And then the team takes those codes, and from those codes, we identify a primary process, again, that core theme, and a primary structure, the context in which that process takes place, changes, disappears, modifies, grows, shrinks, whichever set of adjectives you want to use, right? There are many dimensions to these categories. And then all the other themes that weren't necessarily central, but were still pertinent, how do they connect to this process, this core process, and the core structure? What we didn't include that I think we should include here, or at least be more explicit, is that we have closed-ended surveys. Notice that in the original model, I was just going to have you coders look at just the qualitative data. After reading Lee, I think there is a benefit now to actually including some of the numerical data. Even though I'll be handling the quantitative side of things, I'm going to be using different models to analyze the those quantitative data. Those numbers can still be useful in the memos. And so I think that when we begin coding those cases, the coders should have access to those survey responses that each case gave. And just to be even more explicit, the memo phase clearly influences open coding. And again, it's the first stepping stone. But again, after reading Lee, I'm like, no, we need to be explicit about memo writing in the axial as well as selective coding. How that will manifest, it may not manifest as nuanced as it does here because memoing is designed to extract those themes, but I think memoing can also be useful in helping us settle on a final process and a final structure. And memoing can help us finalize how the other concepts fit within that process structured grid. And we can have conversations through that, through the act of memo.